Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Galo Calderon, and I am the production manager for DATAVERSITY. We would like to thank you for joining the current installment of the monthly DATAVERSITY webinar series, Real World Data Governance with Bob Seiner. Today, Bob will be discussing aligning data governance with corporate social responsibility. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And to note, Zoom does default the chat to send to just the panelists, but you may absolutely switch that to chat with each other. For questions, we will be collecting them via the Q&A section. To find the chat and the Q&A panel, you may click on those icons in the bottom middle of your screen in the toolbar to activate those features. And as always, we will send a follow-up email within 2 business days containing links to the slides, the recording of the session, and any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce you to our speaker for this series, Bob Seiner. Bob is the president and principal of Kick Consulting and Educational Services and the publisher of Emeritus, the Data Administration Newsletter. Bob specializes in non-invasive data governance, data stewardship, and metadata management solutions. And with that, I would like to give the floor to Bob so he can start his presentation. Hello and
Okay.
welcome.
Hey there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. I can hear you.
And
I
can
can
you see
see your
you
screen.
can see my screen too? Well, that's good. Those are two things we need to check off as before we get started. So thank you for the great introduction, and thank you
Mhm.
everybody for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend the session today. Um, this is a very interesting.
Just real quick to let you know, we can see your toolbar at the bottom.
You can see my tool. I think when I
The
click on
Mac
it, it'll
toolbar.
go,
Yeah,
it
you
may
think you
go
should be good.
away.
Okay.
So, let me do that. Okay, there. Is it gone now?
Yes, it is. Yeah, perfect now.
Okay, very good. Um, okay. So again, thank you for taking time to sit with us today for the hour, whether you're attending live or whether you're watching the recording. As I was starting to say, this is kind of a different type of subject for me and for the webinar series. For example, next month I'll be talking about data quality and metadata management and how data governance, how they all tie together with data governance. But when Shannon and I were putting together the subjects for the webinar series for 2025, this subject popped up on our radar several times. And so we didn't know what type of audience we would attract for it or what numbers we would attract for it. But I think it's a very interesting subject. The first thing I want to say is that I don't want to sound like I come across as somebody who is lots of experience working with organizations that have focused their data governance programs on their corporate social responsibility initiatives. Some of my clients certainly talk about it. It's not something that it seems it's not a domain of data that many of the organizations, at least from my experience that I've worked with, have focused on when they've implemented their data governance programs. So for me, it was a great subject just because I think it's fascinating and I think it's something that everybody should be talking about and maybe will be talking about in the near future. But it also gave me the opportunity to kind of dig into it a little bit. And I want to share with you some of the things that I learned and the things that I found out about organizations that are focusing on corporate social responsibility. So let me kind of jump into it. Um, as you may or may not know, this is episode 162 in the series of real world data governance. We've been doing this since 2012. And again, I thank you for spending the time with us and look forward to continuing the series as we move forward here. If you're not familiar with me, I'm just going to spend a minute introducing myself. As Galo said, my name is Bob Seiner. I do this monthly webinar series with DATAVERSITY. We've been doing it for quite some time. It's always the third Thursday of the month. Next month, I'm going to be talking about enhancing metadata governance for for better data quality. So I hope that you'll consider joining us next month around this time. I talk a lot and I write a lot about non-invasive data governance. I'll talk about that a little bit in the session today. I've authored a couple of books, actually a third book I'll talk about in a minute here. I also have online learning plans available through DATAVERSITY, focused on non-invasive data governance, non-invasive metadata governance, and then also the most recent one is around business glossaries, data dictionaries, and data catalogs. The name of my consulting business is KIK Consulting and Educational Services. KIK stands for Knowledge is King. And I refer to it as being the home of non-invasive data governance. And in my spare time, as I like to put it, I'm also an adjunct faculty member and a part-time instructor at Carnegie Mellon University here in my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in their executive education program focused on chief data officers and chief analytic officers and chief AI officers and all of those types of things. So the last thing I want to just mention about myself is the third book in the non-invasive data governance series came out earlier this year. It's called Non-Invasive Data Governance Unleashed. And since everybody's talking about AI, I wanted to relate, how do we empower people within the organization to govern data and AI? Okay, enough about me. Let's kind of get into what we're going to talk about today. There's several subjects, as I typically do with my webinar series. I break it into a handful of subjects, usually saving the last subject to kind of walk through some examples of some organizations that are focusing on the discipline that I'm talking about in that day or in today's webinar. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is kind of bringing together data governance and corporate social responsibility. Obviously I'm going to start with a definition of what corporate social responsibility is, and then talk about how data governance is related to that. And then I'm going to talk about what are some of the ethical data practices that can be put into place to support these types of initiatives within your organization. Then I'm going to talk about how do we take the principles of governance in general and kind of insert them into some of the strategies that organizations are putting in place around social responsibility, talk about promoting sustainability through governance, and then I'm going to wrap up with sharing several examples of types of things that organizations are doing presently to link data governance with their CSR initiatives. So as I always do at the beginnings of my webinar, I start with a handful or a couple at least definitions, and just to share the ones that I always share. And we could talk for a while about this, but I won't. Data governance to me is really the execution and enforcement of authority. So no matter what approach you take to data governance, whether you're taking that command and control top-down approach, or you're taking kind of the traditional approach that I refer to as a if you build it, they will come kind of approach, or even a non-invasive approach, which implies that there's already governance taking place. The bottom line is that data governance you have to execute and enforce authority over the data, or you're not going to find change to people's behavior. You're not going to find changes to the quality in the data. So I word the definition of data governance very strongly. Like I said, the execution and enforcement of authority. And that's really what we're trying to do is we need to make certain that there are rules in place, that there are standards in place, and that they're being followed. And then stewardship I define as the formalization of accountability. So it's really people in the organization already define and produce and use data as part of their job. If they're held formally accountable for how they define, produce, and use data, they're data stewards. So I typically use the statement of everybody in the organization who has a relationship to the data, and if they're being held formally accountable for that relationship, they're a steward of the data. Everybody potentially is a steward of data within the organization. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to specifically focus on this topic that if you're not familiar with it, then maybe you should be doing a little bit of research, because maybe there are people within your company that are thinking about this, or maybe you're involved in these initiatives already. But it's basically what CSR I'll kind of highlight the things that are in red on the screen. It's an organization's accountability to a broader impact from its operations. And so it's not all on based on financial performance. It's also things like social aspects, the ethical aspects, the environmental responsibilities that organizations have. Um, and what we'll do in this session is we'll relate data governance to that. So we'll talk about implementing policies that kind of minimize the miscues in the data, the managing bias around AI models, giving equitable access to the information. What we want to do is we want to kind of align data governance with the activities that are taking place in CSR, and be able to demonstrate that really CSR initiatives are going to fail to return on investment if the data that's behind them is not of high quality, if it's not trusted, if people don't have confidence in the data. So the truth is that as I started to put this webinar together, I was concerned about several things. And one of the things was, well, are organizations right now addressing CSR? Is your organization addressing CSR? I posted a question in the webinar chat as the session was getting started, just asking, is anybody working on this in your organizations? I'm also a little bit concerned about how much this is going to become a focus and how it's going to become important for organizations moving forward. And then, also in the back of my mind, thinking, well, what's going to happen if corporate social responsibility and environmental and social governance and those types of things absolutely just go away? Well, I think we as data practitioners and chief data officers and those types of accountabilities within the organization, we can make certain that CSR is something that's kind of brought to the forefront, and we can focus on how the data aspect of corporate social responsibility is very significant in the success for organizations around this. And I think you'll see that in some ways in some of the examples I'm going to share with you. So I don't see a whole lot of activity in the chat at this point, just kind of keeping my eye on it. But I'm interested in, are any of your organizations at this point, or are any of you focused on corporate social responsibility as part of your job in data governance or data management or whatever position you are in within your organization? So please drop it in the chat if you think it's important. Just want to know if this is actually a present aspect of your job. And it also, if you're interested, I'll get a copy of the chat later. I want to continue the conversation, see if anybody's interested in making certain that this important subject is not going to go away. So before we get into kind of the key points that I laid out in the abstract, with those things being my concern, that there's not as much, at least I'm not hearing as much chatter about corporate social responsibility within organizations. I wanted to let you know that there is a framework that organizations are using, and they refer to it as the ESG framework. I'm not sure if it's attributed to a single organization or if it's just in general, a discipline, but the ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And so that's a good name for it, ESG. Basically, how does your company impact and how is your company impacted by things in the environment? How does your company manage relationships with people in general or with employees and suppliers and customers and those types of things? And how is the data that's going to be used to recognize whether or not you're being successful in these parts of your organization? How is it going to, is it trustable at this point? Does it need to be governed? So how your company is governing and held accountable for the data that you're reporting when it comes to the environmental and the social impact of your organization. And like I said, there's a lot that's written on ESG. Look it up. It's called Environmental, Social, and Governance Framework. And it's closely associated with corporate social responsibility. So right out of the gate, you might be asking the question of what do CSR and ESG have to do with data governance? Well, the fact is that when organizations start to make promises and they start to do reporting on how well they are governing their corporate social responsibility, it all comes down to the data. So in the context of data management and data governance, anything that's ESG related depends on high quality information. It depends on auditable data to track the organization's performance. It focuses on demonstrating compliance when those types of important factors come into play. And so organizations are beginning to look at and to focus their ESG position better, and they're doing that to meet regulatory requirements and to attract investors and to build out trust with the people that they're working most closely with and with their stakeholders. You'll find that a lot of organizations, I don't know whether your organization is doing it or not, they're focusing on these types of initiatives because because their performance increasingly affects these things. And those things include their access to capital, especially when it comes to investments that the organizations are making around ESG and CSR, regulatory compliance. I know that's becoming a bigger thing in Europe, and it's also growing in the US. Certainly, as you'll see with a couple of examples I'm going to share with you, the brand's reputation and being able to attract customers and retain customers, it's a really important aspect of that, and it's a differentiator for some organizations. They're looking to do these things because they want to engage with their employees better and retain employees. And they're looking towards long-term sustainability and risk mitigation in terms of some of the reasons of that they're focusing on these types of initiatives within their organizations. So CSR, corporate social responsibility, and environmental, social, and governance has become a critical strategic and operational lens, and organizations are increasingly being evaluated based on these things. And that evaluation, as you and I know, it has to do with data. And you're not going to evaluate without effective data, and hopefully that data is going to be formally governed. So again, we're trying to make that relationship between data governance and corporate social responsibility. Just real quickly, I want to go through a couple or just several here examples of what some organizations are doing, and then kind of relate what I could find about what how the data is impacting these initiatives. But Microsoft has mentioned that they want to become carbon negative by the year 2030. And they're using data. They're creating sustainability dashboards and advanced data platforms to help them to measure things that they're using, their emissions, their energy use, water consumption. And just as an example of a huge organization that's focusing on CSR, it may not be the most important thing to them in the news, but it is important to them. And I also provide the link or the URL so that you can go out and learn more about it from Microsoft. So Microsoft is certainly one of those organizations leading the way in CSR, and they're focusing on the data. They're using their data and they're governing their data in order to be successful with this initiative. And they're putting a lot of money into this as well. Another company, Patagonia, that you might be familiar with in terms of environmental activism and ethical supply chain. They are building environmental activism into a lot of the things that they're doing, and they're using data governance to support the traceability of different materials and supplier compliance, life cycle analysis, and those types of things. And again, there's the website for you to go to if you're interested in learning more about how Patagonia is focusing on CSR. And then I'm sure there's additional information there too about how the data is being used to help them to be successful in that initiative. IKEA, probably another company that most of you are familiar with. They're talking about sustainability every day, basically. And if you look at their advertisements, it's one of the things that comes to kind of the forefront in some of their advertisements. And they're aiming to become climate positive by 2030. So these things aren't right around the corner, but in the terms of the history of these organizations, to get to this point by 2030, is some big steps for large organizations like that. And some of the things that I've found is that they've structured their data collection and their governance around their supply chain to ensure that the data is good and that they can track these things and they can report on them effectively within the organization. And the last example I want to share before we kind of jump into more of the content is that Google another small company like Google. We talked about Patagonia and Microsoft. I mean, these are all huge organizations. And if you go to the Google or the Alphabet website, they're saying making AI helpful for everyone, including the planet. So they're not just focusing on business. They have a long term, and for a long time, they've been invested in things like renewable energy, carbon neutrality. But as they make claims of things that they're doing, that all needs to be backed up with data. So they're backing up these efforts with meticulous reporting, extensive analytics, AI governance, and those types of things. So again, we know that AI governance is important. We know that data governance is important. Again, if your organization is focusing on things like corporate social responsibility, data is going to become a big part of it. All right, so let's jump into the first of the main topics that I want to talk about today, and that is the intersection, kind of the bringing together of data governance and CSR. And um, and some of the things that I've learned as I've been doing research on this and talked at least lightly with some of the companies that I've worked with is that you really can't be responsible unless you have some reliable data to kind of back that up. So CSR relies on having a trustworthy narrative. Um, and it's something that you don't really want to share with the public unless, it can be you can back it up and you can say that it's built on accurate and complete and timely data. And so my concept of non-invasive data governance that I talk about a lot, it looks to those people already within the organization who are handling this type of data, the sustainability data as an example, or social responsibility data, and it kind of formalizes their accountability rather than making it feel as though it's something that's brand new and something that's being handed to them that they didn't have before. So the first aspect of when we're looking at the intersection of data governance and corporate social responsibility is it's really difficult to be responsible. It's very difficult to be accountable without having some level of reliable data to back you up. In organizations that are focusing on CSR, the transparency, saying that we are doing these types of things, we are attempting to do these things for the planet, for the earth. It's nice to have the intention of doing these things, but once you've made that commitment to do it, it's going to require that there's data that's there to help you to be able to demonstrate, what you're doing, how you're doing it, and you're also going to need to be able to demonstrate where that data comes from, how it's being validated, who has responsibility for that data. So transparency itself, if organizations plan to be transparent, it requires more than just a good intention. It requires that you're going to have to have the data there to back it up. So for example, as it says here, if your organization releases some type of an annual report around sustainability, your reputation and the legal risks of getting something wrong are pretty high within that report. So again, it comes back to the data and making certain that that data is being governed properly, being governed formally, so that you can stand behind those things that you're reporting in these types of reports. I know my friend Scott Taylor will love this because he says everything is a data story, and so certainly corporate social responsibility is a data story, and we want to make it. And as Scott will say, the data whisperer will say, every data story or every story requires data to kind of back it up. So if you're going to tell a story about how your organization is reducing harm or improving lives, you're going to need some complete, meaningful, and consistent data behind that in order to tell that story successfully. And again, to back it up. The bottom line is, as you're telling this story for your organization, it's going to require data. Especially if you want to develop and you want to share a story that people trust, that you're not just throwing numbers out of the blue. People are going to want to come to you, especially if the people are going to invest in your organization. They're going to want to know that you can back up the numbers that you're talking about in terms of corporate social responsibility, in terms of environment and social governance for your organization. The when if you're going to be if ethics is really important to your company, and again, this is not an area that I focus a lot on in my presentations. Um, and if ethical responsibility is important to your organization, well, it's going to also start with ethical data. So an organization, it's very difficult for them to be socially responsible if it doesn't pay attention to managing its data ethically. And I'm going to talk about some ethical practices here in a minute. But taking a proactive view towards defining stewardship, getting people to be accountable for how they're defining, producing, and using data, protecting the sensitive information, all those are really important. Ethical governance for many organizations is no longer something that's just optional, especially when everything that you report is under constant scrutiny. You need to have the data to be able to back up the things that you are saying. And you need to be ethical in the way that you go about collecting that data, in what data you collect, and how you're sharing that data, which, like I said, I'm going to talk about more here in a minute. Actually, that minute is right now. We're going to talk about here. I want to spend a few minutes talking about ethical data practices that can be put in place before, or really just as an aspect to support your CSR initiative. And the first one is one that I run into some issues with from time to time is collecting permission from people or from places before we start to collect the different data. So, first of all, not every type of data that can be collected should be collected. I've heard that said many times, because especially when that data actually has a real impact on people and their rights, and what data is being shared about people. And even, like I said here, even about the data that's being collected about people and about processes and about their lifestyles. Um, so ethical data governance begins with purposeful collection. For these types of initiatives, just having the people that are responsible for collecting the data understand the rules, be involved in the decision making in the organization as to what data we should be collecting, how do we intend to use that data. We need to be considering the permission before the collection of data. And again, there's a lot of data that's out there that can be collected. The question is, should we be collecting it all? Especially if we're not really certain or we're not being very ethical about how that data is being used. CSR certainly depends on fairness and equity. Again, I don't want to read these slides to you, but certainly when you're implementing ethical governance practices, it calls for you proactively identifying, documenting, and mitigating bias at any point of the data lifecycle, but specifically at the source for many organizations. This means kind of building the built-in checks. And for many organizations in the business intelligence environment, the data warehousing environments, they're already building checks into their data lineage. The same thing needs to take place for the data that we're using in terms of CSR and ESG as well. Okay, let's another thing to consider when we're talking about ethical data practices to support your CSR initiatives is, as I started to mention on the last slide, is the right data and the right use. Okay, so demanding information from organizations, from people, we should be very intentional in what our use and how we're going to communicate that data. So if we start to use data without people's trust and we eliminate or we lose their trust, or we use it without their consent, it can certainly erode the trust of people within the CSR initiatives. Um, Again, don't want to read the slides to you, but keeping data aligned with the intentional use of that data is what separates really an organization that is doing good governance from just an organization that has the intentions to do good governance. And as I always say with non-invasive data governance, that accountability in an organization isn't optional. I've talked to a lot of executives, senior leaders in organizations that have told me we have very little formal accountability for a lot of things across the organization, but specifically around our data. And in order to improve the governance of the data that's associated with our CSR initiatives, we need to formalize existing levels of accountability within the organization. And typically, what we find within the organization is there's not just one person or one group within an organization that owns that data. And if you've seen my webinars in the past, you know I don't like to use the term owner because it kind of implies exactly the opposite of what stewardship means. So as we're starting to recognize, well, a steward is somebody who takes care of the data for the organization. When if you use the term owner, it implies that it's their data and that they can make the decisions around it. In some cases, that's true, but I tend to use the word stewardship instead. So when we talk about accountability not being optional for the data associated with our CSR initiatives, let's recognize who in the organization already is defining that data and producing and using it. And let's help share with them what their accountability is and formalize the accountability instead of handing it to somebody as something that's brand new to them. The next subject I want to go through quickly with you is talking about integrating some of the general principles of governance and data governance into your social responsibility strategies. So, some of the things that I've found from talking to organizations and from doing a little bit of research is that those organizations, anybody who's talking right now publicly about their CSR and their ESG initiatives, they're also talking about what they're doing with their data to support those initiatives. So what I found is that people are using CSR as a way to kind of elevate their governance within their organization, but they're also using governance to elevate, or as it says here, strategically multiply their CSR initiatives. So as I mentioned earlier, good intentions aren't going to just pull your program across what I refer to as the finish line. Um, Governance is making certain that the data that you're using, using to report on your CSR initiatives, is accurate, consistent, traceable, protected. And think of governance as you think about any other major initiative within your organization. Anything that has ethical or environmental or social impact in the organization, they're all going to come back to depend on the data. So as your CSR initiative gains strength, potentially, then your governance initiative can go work hand in hand with it and gain strength. Or as your governance initiative is taking hold within your organization, start looking for opportunities, ask questions about corporate social responsibility within your organization, and take it on as a domain within a use case within your organization. I think that governance is not only a CSR multiplier, but CSR could also be a governance multiplier within your organization. Whenever an organization is asked to be transparent about the things that they're putting out there for public consumption, that transparency requires some level of proof. And you and I know that the proof is going to come from the data itself. So governance basically provides typically the policies, the standards, the accountability structure within the organization to help you to be transparent with the data that's associated with these types of initiatives. And when you apply governance to CSR reporting, it also then takes those reports and makes them more meaningful, especially if you're working with the people who are defining the data and the people that are using the data, to make certain the people that are using the data are getting the appropriate data and that they can trust that data and it can be traced back to where the data came from. So again, you can have that level of transparency with the results that you're reporting to the public. And ethics are, have to be built into the operations. It's not something that you just want to aspire to. Basically, when you looked at those headlines or those things that I shared with you from those major organizations I talked about earlier, corporate social responsibility is really built on doing the right thing for the organization. And again, it doesn't really make sense for organizations to put a lot of money into those things. If the right thing is going to be left up to interpretation or inconsistency or even neglect within your organizations. And moving from compliance to commitment, every organization, data governance is a lot of data governance programs are focused on compliance. But once we get past making certain that all the rules and the regulations are documented and that people understand them, that they're being followed, things like corporate social responsibility are going to start to take play a larger role within organizations. So we need to go from just being compliant to having a commitment to being corporate socially responsible and following things like the ESG framework that I talked about earlier. All right, the last subject, and then I'm just going to walk quickly through a couple of examples of things that organizations have done just to hopefully spark some interest in your organization. Good data basically leads to green decisions. So data governance typically ensures the accuracy and the consistency of your data. And certainly when we can focus on the environmental data of the organization, that's going to impact the way that decisions can be made within your organization. Governance provides that backbone for reliability or for reliable sustainability reporting. It ensures that all the data that's being used on your reports are validated and the definitions are standardized across the organization, and the responsibilities and the accountabilities for the quality of that data are clearly, I used the word assigned here, but I would rather use the word recognized. Make certain those accountabilities are being recognized across the organization. And when I talk about accountability, the next words out of my mouth are usually stewardship. Um, Stewards are basically the guardians of the data. They're the enablers, and they're the people that can make things happen when it comes to responsible action around your data. I've written recently on LinkedIn about the word enable being a little bit passive for me. And I like the idea of data governance as being a catalyst to make things happen within organizations. Um, the stewards, those people who define, produce, and use data daily as part of their job, those are the people that, if we can get them engaged, they're the ones that are going to become the catalysts to successful initiatives like CSR or ESG within the organization. And I always talk about recognizing the people in the organization who are already governing the data and helping to formalize their responsibility. Again, I don't use the word assign when it comes to stewardship. We don't need to do that in terms of the data that's associated with CSR. We just need to recognize who in the organization has responsibility for that data, formalize it, and then get them engaged in things like data governance, especially associated with the domains of data that have to do with CSR in the organizations. Governance lights the path to net zero. I talked a little bit about some organizations that are focusing on that. Don't expect to be able to get to be able to measure and to be able to report the results of these things if your organization is focusing on these types of things, unless you have some intentional efforts around the governance of the data, and you're able to kind of embed governance into the things that you're already doing within your organization to help you to achieve that path to net zero. One of my clients recently was talking about how there's data hoarding taking place in the organization. There's probably a lot of resources that have data that are associated with CSR within your organization. Certainly, doing an investigation or doing some level of an inventory around what data is specifically associated with CSR and where that data exists within the organization. Again, you don't know what data you have in order to do this type of reporting until you start asking people the question and you start doing a data inventory within your organization. So again, sharing the information about the data that's available will help you to break down your silos and reduce, certainly redundant efforts that could have to do with these types of initiatives. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to spend a couple minutes here talking about some use cases and things that I discovered about organizations and how they're using data to help them with their CSR initiatives. And then I'm going to turn it back to our host here and see if we have any questions for today. So the first one I want to talk about is, organizations that are using, that are focusing on cleaner air and having an environmental impact, and they're doing reporting on what they're on how they're tracking emissions, energy usage, and those types of things. Well, between you and me and everybody else, those decisions come down to data. And so without governance, organizations are taking the risk that they're making decisions based on incorrect data, or they're accused of just making up data or greenwashing, as the term is used, uh, greenwashing their data. So at the bottom of each of these use cases, I wanted to list out several items and things that they're measuring, things that they're doing. So in this organization, they standardized emissions and waste data. They defined and documented environmental data. It says assigned stewards because I believe that's the approach that they took. But however you determine who your stewards are, they determined that they had stewards to oversee what their carbon footprint and environment and energy metrics were, and they applied validation rules for reducing errors in their dashboards. Another organization that was focused on human rights and DEI, they classified their DEI related data, they documented clear ownership for the data, they improved data collection, and they enabled reliable metrics. Those are all data related activities that were focused on them getting to the point where they could share their results with the public, basically. Many organizations are still or have always been focusing on their supply chain. It's even more important now than ever. There's examples of organizations that define what their required fields are and their formats to get suppliers certified. They applied stewardship. As you notice, that's an ongoing theme in these use cases is the application of stewards, activating, engaging the people in the organization that are closest to the data. And that certainly holds true for your CSR and ESG initiatives as well. They standardized their ESG related performance indicators, and they supported traceability from the beginning to the end, from basically from their raw materials to their retail shelves. And the last one I believe that I want to talk about is, just organizations that are talking about data governance in terms of their CSR reporting. And they say CSR reporting is not just about doing good, it's about being good. It's about being able to demonstrate that they're being good. And some of the things that they've done is they've documented their sources and their definitions. I'm sure a lot of you are already doing these types of things for your organization. The same thing can be done for the data that falls within the CSR domain. They implemented controls to prevent manipulation. They coordinated governance between different activities that were taking place in their organization. Um, so again, there are examples of organizations that are doing this and that are using data substantially to back up and to demonstrate and be very transparent about the results that they're sharing. So again, as I said at the beginning, this is kind of a different type of presentation for me because it's not something that I live in day to day. But I'd really love to hear from you if you're interested in talking about this subject or digging a little bit deeper on it. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of companies that are focusing on these things. These are the four that I talked about at the beginning of the session today. And so I'd love to hear from you if you are in fact doing anything in your organization to align your data governance with your CSR initiatives. So the things I talked about today was kind of bringing data governance and CSR together. We talked about ethical practices to support these types of initiatives. We talked about taking some of the core principles of data governance and governance in general and inserting them into social responsibility strategies. Talked about promoting sustainability. And then I shared with you some examples of organizations that are already doing this and where the data kind of fits into those conversations. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Gallo to see if there's any questions today.
Alrighty. Well, we do have a few uh, remarks and questions. So the first two are actually replying to your anybody working in CSR. We do also have some comments here in the chat as well. So this is from Barbara saying, I work in state government. Our whole reason for being is social responsibility.
So that doesn't sound like a question. It sounds like a
Yep.
comment. So I'd love to have a conversation with you about where, I mean, I'm guessing that you're a data practitioner because you're here today. I would love to hear how the data fits into that, and that would be a great conversation to have. So good to have you here. Thank you.
We have a question from Ariel asking, do you know the percentage of organizations that govern CSR?
I do not. And as I said, I've worked with a lot of major organizations around the country and around the world, and they all seem to talk about it. But any questions about the types of activities they're taking? That's one of the reasons I asked the question at the beginning of the webinar is how many of your organizations actually have initiatives that are focused on it? We know Barbara, that her life is focused on it. I don't have an answer for you, but if I needed to make an uneducated guess, I would say that at least 50% of companies are talking about it, but probably far less than that are actually have initiatives in place. I could be wrong.
This is another question from Ariel asking for data retention, analytics, and operational data has different requirements. We're investigating obfuscation on analytic data, but currently it's the same data structure. Any ideas of this?
Well, I would say again from a data retention perspective, that the rules are the rules. So I wouldn't think it would matter as to which platform you're using, where the data is, that certain data needs to be retained, and that if you retain it beyond a certain point, that it's either going to be risky or it's not required for your organization. That's what my comments are, is that I think retention is a important aspect of governance, and certainly it's kind of written into the DM and those types of things that you need to know what the retention rules are and you need to follow them, and they need to be governed. I mean, there's a lot of organizations that have very old data sitting around in different types of resources, and they're starting to recognize that that's a big risk. So we need not only to retain the data for a certain period of time, but we need to eliminate the data when the data is expected to be eliminated as well.
And then we have a question from Monica. What advice do you have for folks who are not decision makers in their organizations, who are committed to applying these principles where possible, but often have limited opportunity?
Well, and I think it's you need to make your own opportunity, right? You need to and I talked about a data story. You've got to have a compelling story to tell. I mean, if you can do research within your organization as to what activities are taking place around CSR, around ESG, and you can identify who in the organization is the right person to talk to, you may not have the authority to do those things, but you could go it to them with a compelling story that says, hey, we're here to support you. And they may have never made that connection between CSR and data governance. You don't necessarily, somebody in the organization has to have the authority to say that things are going to happen, but it doesn't need to be us. It doesn't need to be the data practitioners. Great question, though. Thank you.
That is all of the questions we have here in our Q&A.
Well, I said that, like I
We
said,
do have
the
a
subject is relatively new to
yes.
at least to me, but it sounds as though there's interest in it. And again, if anybody has an interest in keeping the conversation going, on the screen right now, you see my LinkedIn address, my email address. Please reach out. Love to talk to you about it.
Ready? Well, thank you, Bob, for this great presentation and Q&A. Seeing as how we don't have any other comments, that will be our session for today. We just want to remind everyone that we will be posting the recorded webinar and slides to dataversity.net within 2 business days, and we will send out a follow-up email with the links and other requested information. Thank you all for attending today's webinar, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.